experimental evidence that the flow of time is a perceptual illusion. So please welcome Ronald Gruber.
My colleague Rick Block and I would like to share with you what we believe is some experimental evidence that the flow of time is a perceptual illusion. I'm going to briefly go through a few things in this talk, the meaning of the flow of time, our hypothesis, methods and results, and we'll compare it to some other experiments and what relation it has to the species present, and finally take a guess at what the universe would be like without that illusion of motion. Now, it was Einstein a number of years ago, as you know, who said the flow of time is a stubbornly persistent illusion. The problem is that there's been no experimental evidence whatsoever. The flow of time is actually has two components, a past, present, future with a moving present. We all feel it. It's said to be, it flows like a river, as you see here. But this is a high-level perception of the flow of time. The other aspect is happening. And by happening, I mean the examples are spatial change, motion, color change, auditory change, and a volcano exemplifies all three of those. And this is a low-level perception of the flow of time. But first, we must deconstruct the low-level flow of time, and that's the level I wish to pursue today. Rick and I want to share with you the following. Gibson some years ago said that a sequence of external stimuli provide a flow of change, and it is this we perceive rather than a flow of time as such. And David Park, a physicist, went a step further and said something quite profound. Discussions of time become more clear if one drops the word time entirely and substitutes one of the words change or event. So really, the flow of time, at least this lower level flow of time, is synonymous with the flow of events, and that is similar or synonymous with happening. Now, the illusion advocates include largely the post-Einstein physicists, and clearly the majority are in favor of the notion that it is an illusion because of the block universe theory depicted here in the lower right. You have a lot of space-time in slices, the Earth from future to present to past, with the moon circling around it in a spiral fashion. And these events, these space-time events, are just there. Motion is not a physical property in this theory. There's no need to invoke it, and for that matter, happening is also not a physical property. The non-illusion advocates are in the minority, but with people such as Prigogine. Our hypothesis is that the happening is a perceptual illusion as stated, but the fact is the hypothesis is that it can be eliminated, that Einstein's illusion is not completely stubborn. It is an illusion and irrelevant, and therefore not a physical property. The flow of time, at least the happening component, is an illusion. Now you recall the phi phenomena, technically beta, shining a spot to the left and then to the right, and when the frequency of the shining of the spots goes up to 5 to 15 hertz, we get that illusion of motion, and it occurred to us that we should consider the possibility that the FOE, or motion, for example, is also frequency dependent, and therefore it is not always perceived. So we did the following very, very simple experiment. We took 10 equally spaced frames, or snapshots, captured from a walking scene, as you see here, of a man carrying a stool from one side of a parking lot to the other, from its beginning to its end, with an interstimulus interval that varied anywhere between a half, 3, or 7 seconds. This one happens to be 3 seconds. And here's one with a half-second ISI, interstimulus interval. Quite simple. Then we would ask the participants for their happening judgment to give us an answer, A or B. A, yes, I could see it happening. I sensed his motion across the parking lot. Or B, no, I could not see it actually happening or sense his motion, but the individual slides told me he must have gone from one side to the other. And a simple plot of the spatial change as a function of interstimulus interval suggests that at a half a second ISI, the participants still sensed motion, but as the ISI increased, by the time we got down to 7 seconds, by 75% of the participants lost the percept of spatial change or motion. We did the same thing with color change. 10 equally spaced frames, snapshots were captured from a bread product, as you see here, a triangle of toast, from its beginning to its end, and then set the ISI between frames or stimuli to either half, 3, or 7 seconds. This one happens to be a 3-second ISI. And again, ask the same simple question. Yes, I could see it actually happening. I saw it become toasted. No, I could not see it actually happening. But the individual slides told me it must have become toasted. The results were similar, but at half a second, only 80% of the responses were A, that is, they could see it happening. And by 7 seconds ISI, most of the participants lost the percept of color change. If we combine the two on a chart, and you can see that there is a difference. The color change percept is lost earlier than motion, and that there was a small statistically significant difference between the two. So our immediate conclusion was that the flow of events or happening is a frequency-dependent percept, suggestive of being a perceptual illusion. It would appear that the high ISI, or low frequency, the flow of events reverts to Gibson's sequence of events. In other words, events become relatively static. To get an even greater appreciation of what this means, we need to compare these results to other frequency-dependent illusions, such as continuous motion and an auditory illusion that is a superimposed percept. Let's go first to the continuous motion. Perception of motion, as you know, takes place in discrete processing frames or snapshots. At least our best evidence suggests that. It's demonstrated best by the wagon wheel illusion, as you see here, in continuous light. I'm not talking about stroboscopic light. This is more like the hubcap on a car. And that much of our evidence suggests that sampling occurs at about 14 hertz. And this motion appears continuous, but it's actually a type of illusion. The brain is filling in for those intervals of observation. We are told that we should think of motion as painted onto each snapshot and not experienced because of a change in position between two consecutive snapshots. But we should look carefully at this continuous motion and ask if it's an illusory percept or a property. It appears that it is a perceptual illusion. The wagon wheel experiment actually does not, however, prove that continuous motion is not a property. It doesn't say anything about the property of motion. It just says that the brain paints it on. And that's because the percept of continuous motion is not irrelevant in the experiment. The percept provides necessary information of the stimulus, namely the wheel location at any point in time. The motion is, because it's not irrelevant, we cannot say anything about the property of continuous motion. That's an open question. Let me go to another type of illusion, an auditory illusion, a superimposed percept. And I'd like you to listen to this carefully, please. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Beethoven's Fifth. The four most popular, well-known notes in all of classical music. Music is a perceptual illusion when the same auditory information is separated by 3 or 4 seconds, as was done in the first rendition here. The percept was lost. In fact, on a small study, 34% of individuals shown this audio did not recognize it as Beethoven's Fifth, even though they are familiar with it. So music is an illusory percept, but not a property. The percept is lost and irrelevant at low frequencies, but the brain perceives all relevant information, pitch, frequency, volume. And we see this in amusia patients, some of whom can listen to an entire symphony, hear all the notes, everything about it, but have no idea that it's music. It's simply noise to them, which means if irrelevant, music need not be invoked as a property, and that's how we can tell whether something is an illusion or not. Let's go back then to the flow of events and decide, is it an illusory percept and not a property? And there are 2 reasons for it. The first is, as I just said, is the irrelevance factor. The percept is lost and irrelevant at low frequencies in the walking man experiment. The participants received all the relevant information, duration and chronology, where the man was and what the order of events was across the parking lot. So since the percept of the FOE, the flow of events, is irrelevant at low frequencies, there's really no reason for it to be relevant in high frequencies. And since it's irrelevant for incoming information, I would argue that the flow of events happening need not be invoked as a property and is not a property. There's a second reason, the asymmetry of percepts. Here's the data I'm recalling here on the right, noting the difference between walking and color. If the flow of events is a property, the frequency at which its percept is lost should be independent of the nature of the stimulus. After all, the brain would have no reason to distinguish the happening property of motion from the happening property of color change. That would make no sense at all. Happening is one. For those who advocate it, is that motion and happening are properties, it must be, they're one and the same. When we first did this experiment, we thought that it had something to do with the specious present, or the now. You're all familiar with the fact that that now interval of approximately 3 seconds, some say it's longer, is when the brain compares very recent high-density memories like opening and closing your fist quickly. And our pilot studies were done, therefore, with an ISI of 3 seconds because it was suspected that as a result of bypassing the now, that is, presenting the second stimulus more than 3 seconds after the first, the latter would become a relatively old memory. It was conjectured that the brain would not be able to paint or superimpose an illusory percept upon the older low-density memories. However, as you see from the data, happening was lost closer to 7 seconds than 3 seconds, suggesting that the illusion is more likely related to the frequency per se. Now, we're not the first to suggest that motion is a perceptual illusion, based upon the observation that a few patients saw the world as a cinematographic sequence of stills, clinically called a kinetopsia, Oliver Sacks suggested that the continuous passage of time and movement were an illusion. And Francis Crick and Christoph Koch remarked that rare migraines temporarily inactivate cortical motion areas, thereby depriving patients of the illusion of motion. Well, let me hazard a guess as to what the perception would be like without the illusion of happening at high frequencies. You saw it at low frequencies. And based on all that we know, it's very likely similar to a flip book. This one here is from the Celebrex commercial on television. And there's this big page turning seems to create this impression of a loss of motion until the rate becomes quite high. And the only caveat to that would be that the flipbook effect would have to be at about 14 hertz if we assume that's the rate at which the brain makes these visual perceptions. And that's the closest guess we can hazard in terms of what the world would look like if we could get rid of the percept at the low frequencies. At the high frequencies, rather. So in summary, the flow of time has these two components, a past, present, future with a flowing present like a river, but also the flow of events, a happening, a percept that involves motion, color change, auditory change. But we believe that the flow of events is a frequency-dependent perceptual illusion. Einstein said it is a stubbornly persistent illusion, but now we believe that we at least have some experimental evidence to corroborate that notion. Thank you very much.
Okay, one over here.
Dave?
Here.
You may have a different definition of illusion than I, but to me an illusion is you have knowledge that doesn't accurately represent your reference. So what I hear you saying is you have knowledge that flows of something that doesn't flow. Is that?
Well, typically, an illusion is something that contradicts what science tells us. Is that not so?
You have knowledge of it.
You have knowledge of it. Well, okay.
Well, it's actually not. So does the knowledge flow?
Is the knowledge flow? I don't know the answer to that one. I will tell you that you can see the difficulty of the problem all these decades of times in Einstein, and that is, how do you prove that something is an illusion, which by definition is something that should contradict physics, when you don't have any, when physics is not telling it to us? We have to go about it in a roundabout way, as we did here, to try to prove something is an illusion without the physics. And we had to resort to the psychological experiments to do it. It's a very awkward way. Normally, we simply do we not turn to science to determine if what we're seeing agrees with the scientific experiment.
An illusion is a misapplication of a concept, or at least that's a necessary condition. So in the illusion of time, or illusion of flow of time illusion, there's got to be this concept of flow. Where does that concept, what is its content? If it's like a qualia, as it were, flow qualia, then you've got to explain how that, as it were, comes into the world. On the other hand, if you say, look, there's no flow qualia, then how do you have your illusion? Because there's no content to the concept that gets misapplied. It's like a dilemma. I don't know if it really works, but...
Do me a favor. Say that again and briefly. I'm not sure what you're asking.
Okay, it's kind of like this. What's the content of the concept that gets misapplied, that we're applying incorrectly to the world, the flow concept? If its content comes from a kind of qualia, And you seem to be suggesting that in some way. Then you've got to explain for the origin of that. It's sort of like the hard problem, as it were, for the flow qualia. On the other hand, if you say it isn't there, then, as it were, there's no content to have an illusion with, right? There's sort of, in other words, the concept's completely empty, so you can't say there's a misapplied concept here. I probably could say that better.
Well, I didn't want to make the concept of illusion any more difficult than it is.
I'm saying you can't avoid that difficulty if you really.
Well, I would just, I don't think I have a simpler way of explaining it other than to say that there are many types of illusions, of course, as you know, and we get, you can get into the psychoses, hallucinations versus visual illusions.
Sorry, next one here.
So it seems to me that when presenting participants with images with such a slow frame rate, there may be some misunderstanding of what you mean when asking them if they seem to see the change flowing. Do you think that your participations had a consistent interpretation of this question? And do you think you're being sufficiently cautious in interpreting their response to it?
That's a good question. That was the heart of the difficulty of the experiment, actually. On the one hand, it looks so simple. On the other hand, you have to ask the appropriate question. And it took quite a while to figure out that the only way to do it was to give them a choice as to whether or not they felt something was happening or motion. If you just ask them, if you ask participants, is something moving, you can slow that rate down to any number you want, and you'll get a whole wide variety of mixed results. You're not going to be able to figure out what they mean. So these were the questions, A and B, that seem to elicit the best response, rather than just say, do you see something moving? Because they'll say that with any rate, no matter what you show. At least some of them will. The only way we're able to distinguish happening from non-happening, color change from non-color change, was to set the text to the way I showed it to you. That is, I sensed the motion, I did not sense the motion, but the frames told me that something must be, they must have done it. And this is similar to the notion, it really comes from the view of the static physical world, and that is you should be able to, if time is, if the flow of events doesn't exist, we should at least be able to have the information there and know that an event occurred.
Here.
I agree with your conclusion, generally speaking, that change is more fundamental than time. Time is more like an abstraction pasted on top of it, which you could call an illusion. But you need to realize how insidious this is, because throughout your presentation you referred to frequency, which is change per unit time, of course.
Yeah.
And it goes all the way down into the foundations of physics.
That's true.
They're not going to be much help there. The Hamiltonian, the Lagrangian, the Schrodinger equation, they're all functions of time. Right. So much so that many physicists think the whole concept needs to be ripped out somehow, but nobody knows how to do it.
Your point is well taken, and you'll notice I didn't use the word time because it is so ambiguous, and I couldn't avoid frequency. Well, I just stick with ISI, interstimulus interval. But you're right about what you say. It's just that in order to get a grip on this whole topic, I think Rick and I adopted David Park's view that we must take the word time out, the word time, out of our discussion in order to understand what we're talking about. And I agree with you that change may be a more fundamental aspect of it, but we had to put it together with motion and color change and et cetera.
Sue.
Before I ask my question, can I plead, are there any technicians in this building who can hear me? I've got 4 layers of clothes on, including a coat. I'm freezing cold, and I see everyone else putting their coats on, and it's raining outside, and help! I'm also bothered by your concept of illusion in a slightly different way. I'm trying to get a grip on it through you comparing it with property. And I'm wondering, property of what?
Physical
I mean,
property.
Yeah,
Like mass.
but that's not good enough in the sense that if I think about the color of these chairs, I mean, color is not a property of that chair. Color is a property of the chair and the particular kind of visual system I have.
No, but
And
color
so
is
that's my question, is what it's a property
You're
of.
right, but color is, you know, is the color yellow is how we perceive an electromagnetic incoming wave, and so it's a necessary perception of what is being emitted, and what is being emitted we just define as the property, which is different than music. That's the point, where we get all the percepts of sound, pitch, and volume. Those can all be qualia, so to speak, but we add on music as an extra illusion. But the color yellow, we sort of need that because that's the way our brain sees a physical property of the object we're looking at.
Aren't we talking about illusion as consciousness? Because the example you gave at the very beginning of showing two dots moving back and forth, and we either saw a movement or we didn't, depending on the frequency of it. And as you said, that movement, it depends on the frequency. But when you see a movement, it's an illusion. It is something that is being perceived by the brain, that you see it happening. And it's really not any different from seeing a movement in a dream where there's no external event. Seeing is an illusion. When I see you there, it is an illusion that happens to be correct. So the more general sense of illusion is not some, I think it's rather more basic than what we're talking about. It's simply that the world is an illusion. It means consciousness is an image, right? And so what we're experiencing right now, do you see the movement of the hand? There's obviously a physical change occurring, but as you perceive the movement or not depends on your brain, presumably, but certainly your mind and your experience. The experience is the whole illusion.
Well, I suppose you could say that everything is an illusion. I mean, one of the Greek philosophers,
Yes.
I believe it was Parmenides, who said that everything is, in effect, an illusion. That's the way we perceive the world, but I didn't want to get that far out.
So since we see movement, we see motion at the high frequencies, and we don't see motion at the low frequencies, by parity of reasoning, do you think motion is an illusion?
Yes.
Well, okay, last one. I'm sorry, was it the, yeah, from the blue there.
All very interesting, and thank you. I was looking at the results, especially the ones where you found the sound detection for the Beethoven, and how you had, what, about 34% that didn't perceive, and I think that's at the right figure?
They didn't recognize it as Beethoven.
Yeah, and I'm more interested in the 66% that did, and that made me wonder about holographic memory, because I got it first note. I knew it was Beethoven, and I don't know if that's psychic or not, but I do know that I noted the note, and if information is qualia or a quantum proposition, some people are going to be able to detect the information more quickly. So to put it in the context, I mean, there's another interpretive way of looking at the data, and I would only invite people to consider that you have two or more possibilities of looking at this in different ways.
There might well be another way of interpreting it. I appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much.